The mountains stand still, blanketed in fog, hiding secrets that never died. Among those secrets is a hospital, where no one dares to go. The locals say the dead walk its halls, their last moments of terror frozen in time. And tonight, one soul will return, Dr. Ava Stevens, to finish what was left undone. But she doesn't know, she's the next patient. Dr. Ava Stevens was one of the most renowned surgeons in her field. She had spent her entire career dedicated to saving lives, but it wasn't always successful. 5 years ago, Ava's world crumbled after one particular surgery went horribly wrong. A young man, barely in his 20s, was wheeled into her operating room after a severe car accident. He was losing blood fast, but Ava was confident she could save him. It was late at night, the hospital dim and quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the smell of disinfectant. The surgery seemed routine until, in the final moments, something went wrong. The heart monitor flatlined. Despite her efforts, the young man died on the table. She could have sworn she saw his hand twitch even after death. The tragedy haunted Ava, leading her to resign from the hospital soon after it shut down. But the ghost of her failure followed her. Night after night, she dreamt of the young man's final stare, his wide, lifeless eyes boring into hers as the machines went silent. Unable to shake the feeling that she had left something unfinished, Ava returned to the abandoned hospital 5 years later. She had received an anonymous letter that read, "You weren't done. Come back." Believing it to be her final chance for closure, she stepped into the building once more. The hospital was now a decaying shell of its former self, its once sterile halls now cloaked in dust and darkness. The flickering light from her flashlight illuminated the broken tiles beneath her feet, and the cold air seemed to grip her skin like icy fingers. She found her way to the operating room where the surgery had taken place, the room eerily untouched as if time had frozen it the night she left. As she approached the table, a familiar chill ran down her spine. The surgical tools lay scattered, exactly as they had been. But something was different. There was fresh blood on the floor, pooling beneath the table. The heart monitor, disconnected for years, suddenly beeped. The noise echoed in the empty room, and Ava's breath hitched in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she turned around slowly. The young man, her patient, stood in the corner, his hospital gown stained with blood, his eyes wide and hollow. "You left me unfinished." His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible, yet it echoed in her ears. Panic surged through her as the lights flickered wildly. The patient moved closer, his feet dragging against the floor, leaving bloody smears. Ava stumbled back, trying to escape, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The heart monitor blared louder, the flatline piercing her ears as the young man grabbed her wrist with an icy grip. "You're next," he whispered, pushing her onto the operating table. Her screams were cut short as his cold hands pinned her down. The surgical tools lifted off the tray by an invisible force, hovering above her. The last thing Ava saw before her world went dark was the scalpel descending toward her chest. In the dead of night, a mountain hospital once known for saving lives became something much darker. The whispers of an eerie presence, a nurse who roams the hallways long after the hospital closed, linger. Tonight, Megan Davis, a nurse haunted by a memory, will confront her fears. But the night nurse is waiting, and she never lets anyone leave without paying the price. Megan Davis was fresh out of nursing school when she took a job at the mountain hospital. She worked the night shift, where strange stories filled the air like a bad omen. The older nurses would talk in hushed tones about the night nurse, a spirit that wandered the halls after hours. They said she was once a dedicated nurse who had lost her life while trying to save patients during a brutal winter storm. But after death, she wasn't the same. Patients started disappearing under her care, their bodies found cold, drained of life, without explanation. Megan never believed the stories, brushing them off as old hospital folklore. But one night, she saw her. A figure in a white nurse's uniform, standing at the end of the hall. Megan blinked, and she was gone. The next morning, Her patient in room 12 was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Shaken, Megan quit her job and left the hospital behind, but the memory of the night nurse never left her. For years, she was haunted by nightmares of that pale figure standing in the dark. After years of running, Megan couldn't take it anymore. She returned to the abandoned hospital, determined to face her fears and put the past behind her. She needed answers. Was the night nurse real? Or had her mind played tricks on her that night? The hospital was a graveyard of memories, long forgotten by the world but still very much alive in Megan's mind. She walked through the decrepit halls, her footsteps echoing off the broken tiles. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and decay, the shadows dancing in the dim light of her flashlight. As she approached room 12, the same room where her patient had mysteriously died, she heard a faint whisper, "Megan." Her heart raced as the temperature dropped. The door to room 12 slowly creaked open by itself. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, the room was exactly as she remembered, except for one thing. A figure stood in the corner, her back turned to Megan. The night nurse. Megan tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind her. The air grew thick, and the room spun as the night nurse turned to face her. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and empty, her lips curled into a twisted smile. She took slow, deliberate steps toward Megan, her voice like a low growl. "You never should have come back." Megan froze as the night nurse reached out with cold, bony fingers, touching her arm. A sharp pain shot through Megan's body as her skin turned ice cold. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The room seemed to collapse around her as darkness consumed her. The next day, Megan's body was found lying on the floor of room 12, cold, lifeless, her eyes wide open in terror. The night nurse had claimed another victim. In the mountains, where the air is thin and the shadows stretch long, there lies a hospital filled with secrets. Some patients came for healing, but not all left. One patient in particular remains, a silent presence that haunts the empty rooms. Jacob Hill, a troubled soul, will come face to face with this mystery. But silence can be deadly. Jacob Hill had struggled with his mental health for years. Voices, hallucinations, and paranoia had plagued him since he was a teenager. After a violent episode, he was admitted to the psychiatric ward of the Mountain Hospital. His stay there was meant to stabilize him, but it had the opposite effect. He became obsessed with the stories of a woman who was admitted years before, a patient who never spoke a word, never moved, but was said to still be alive in the walls of the hospital. Jacob had spent hours sitting outside room 13, where the woman was kept. He felt drawn to her, convinced that she held the key to understanding his own torment. But one night, she disappeared, and no one could explain how. After that, Jacob's mental state deteriorated further, and he was eventually discharged. But he never forgot about the silent woman. Years later, Jacob returned to the hospital, desperate to find the truth about the silent patient. He believed that confronting her would finally give him peace and clarity. But what he didn't know was that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The hospital was like a maze, the once busy psychiatric ward now a hollow shell of its former self. Jacob wandered through the empty halls, his mind racing with memories of the past. He found his way to room 13, the door slightly ajar as if someone had been waiting for him. Inside, the room was as he remembered it, small, bare, except for the hospital bed in the corner. But something was wrong. The bed wasn't empty. A figure lay beneath the sheets, unmoving. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he approached. His fingers trembled as he reached out to pull the sheet back, revealing the pale, lifeless face of the silent patient. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the lights flickered. The room grew colder, and the air thickened with an oppressive silence. The woman's eyes shot open, staring straight at Jacob. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. In the silence, Jacob heard a voice, not the woman's but his own. It whispered, You were never alone. The woman sat up slowly, her eyes locked on Jacob's, her mouth still moving in that eerie, soundless way. His mind reeled as he realized the truth. She wasn't just a patient. She was a part of him, a reflection of the madness that had consumed him all those years ago. Jacob tried to scream, but the silence suffocated him. The room closed in around him as the woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his skin. The last thing he saw was her face, inches from his own, her silent scream echoing in his mind. Deep in the bowels of a forgotten hospital lies a basement where the shadows move and the walls whisper. No one knows what lurks below, but once you step inside, you never leave the same. Olivia Young, a curious soul, will soon find out why the basement was sealed. But the shadow is always hungry. Olivia Young was an investigative journalist, always on the hunt for the next big story. When she heard about the abandoned hospital in the mountains, she couldn't resist. She had been chasing ghost stories for years, debunking myths and exposing truths. But this hospital was different. Locals spoke of a shadow that lived in the basement, a dark, malevolent force that fed on fear. Olivia didn't believe in ghosts, but the idea of a haunted hospital intrigued her. She decided to explore the building and get to the bottom of the mystery. After breaking into the hospital, Olivia's curiosity got the best of her. She found a stairwell that led down to the basement, the air thick with moisture and decay. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over her, she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. The basement was dark, the only light coming from Olivia's small flashlight. The walls were damp, covered in moss and mildew, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. As she moved deeper into the basement, she heard a faint whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the whispering grew louder. Olivia spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly in the darkness. But there was nothing there, only shadows. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she continued forward, the whispering now a low, guttural growl. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, writhing and twisting as if alive. Panic set in, but Olivia forced herself to keep going. She had to know what was down here. At the far end of the basement, she found a door. It was old, rusted, barely hanging on its hinges. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair in the center. But there was something else, something lurking in the shadows. Olivia stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. As she did, the shadow moved, slowly taking shape. It was tall, its form undefined, but its presence was overwhelming. The growl grew louder, and the shadow lunged toward her. Olivia screamed, turning to run, but the door slammed shut. The shadow engulfed her, its cold, inky blackness swallowing her whole. She fought to escape, but it was too strong. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of her own heartbeat, growing fainter and fainter. The next morning, her camera was found at the hospital entrance, but Olivia was nowhere to be seen. The locals say the shadow took her, and now it waits in the basement for its next victim.